Forget everything Hollywood taught you about the Wild West. Those heroic cowboys riding into sunsets, dramatic shootouts at high noon, and romantic frontier towns filled with noble pioneers. It's all complete fantasy designed to sell movie tickets. The real American frontier of the 1870s was an absolute nightmare that would mentally and physically destroy most modern people within hours of arrival. We're talking about a hellscape where the average human lifespan was a shocking 35 years, where 1 in every 4 children never saw their 5th birthday, and where diseases we consider ancient history could wipe entire communities off the map in a matter of weeks.
If you think you're tough enough to survive pioneer life because you've been camping or lived without Wi-Fi for a weekend, you're about to get a reality check that will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about the Old West. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why 21st century humans wouldn't last even 24 hours in the actual Wild West, and why the people who did survive deserve far more respect than any Hollywood cowboy ever could. If you think you're tough enough to survive pioneer life because you've been camping or lived without Wi-Fi for a weekend, you're about to get a reality check that will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about the Old West. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why 21st century humans wouldn't last even 24 hours in the actual Wild West, and why the people who did survive deserve far more respect than any Hollywood cowboy ever could.
Picture this nightmare scenario. You wake up in a frontier cabin somewhere in the Dakota Territory, year 1875. The first sensation isn't sight or sound, but smell. Before you even crack your eyelids open, you're assaulted by an odor so overwhelming it makes you gag. This isn't the crisp mountain air or fresh prairie breeze you might imagine from Western movies. Instead, you're breathing in a toxic cocktail of human body odor, animal waste, rotting food scraps, and raw sewage that hangs in the air like an invisible poison cloud.
Most frontier settlers consider taking a full bath a monthly luxury, and honestly, that's being incredibly generous. Many people, especially during the brutal winter months, went 3 to 6 months without any real washing because water was far too precious to waste on personal hygiene when every drop was needed for drinking, cooking, and keeping livestock alive. The result was communities of people whose body odor was so intense it could be detected from hundreds of yards away. Women wore the same heavy woolen undergarments for weeks at a time, never washing them because soap was expensive and hard to obtain. Men worked in the same clothes day after day, their shirts and pants becoming stiff with accumulated sweat, dirt, and bodily fluids. The stench was so overwhelming that many contemporary accounts describe visitors becoming physically ill just from entering frontier towns. But the human body odor was just the beginning of your olfactory nightmare. Animal waste was everywhere because horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens were integrated into daily life in ways modern people can't comprehend. Horses were the primary transportation, meaning their droppings accumulated in streets, around buildings, and anywhere people traveled. In major frontier towns, the accumulated horse manure could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas, creating a breeding ground for flies and disease that would make modern health inspectors faint. Cattle drives brought thousands of animals through settlements, leaving behind massive amounts of waste that simply sat in the sun, rotting and attracting swarms of insects. Pig pens were located right next to homes,
because families couldn't afford to lose valuable livestock to thieves or predators. The combination of animal waste, human waste, and rotting garbage created a smell so intense that many travelers reported being able to detect frontier settlements from miles away, long before they could see any buildings.
Now let's talk about your sleeping arrangements, which would make the worst motel room seem like paradise. That bed you're lying on isn't actually a bed as you understand it. It's a crude wooden frame supporting a mattress stuffed with straw, corn husks, or, if you were really lucky, some feathers from birds that had been hunted and eaten. This makeshift mattress is absolutely crawling with bed bugs, fleas, lice, and other parasites that have been accumulating from previous occupants for months or even years.
Bed bugs were so common in frontier accommodations that people simply accepted waking up covered in itchy, painful bites as a normal part of life. These blood-sucking parasites hide in every crack and crevice of wooden furniture during the day, then emerge at night to feast on sleeping humans. The bites don't just itch, they can become infected, leading to serious health complications in an era when antiseptic didn't exist.
But bed bugs were just one type of parasite you'd be sharing your sleeping space with. Fleas jumped from person to person, spreading diseases including the bubonic plague. Body lice lived in clothing and bedding, causing intense itching and skin infections. Dust mites triggered allergic reactions in people who had never experienced such problems before arriving on the frontier. The combination of all these parasites meant that getting a good night's sleep was virtually impossible.
The wooden floor beneath your feet tells its own story of frontier hygiene standards. It's covered in a thick layer of dirt, mud, animal hair, food scraps, and bodily fluids that has been accumulating for months. Sweeping was done occasionally, but without proper cleaning supplies or techniques, the floor remained filthy. During winter months, melting snow and ice created muddy pools that soaked into the wooden planks, creating perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and mold.
Most frontier cabins had dirt floors rather than wooden ones, which were considered a luxury. These dirt floors became muddy quagmires during rain, dusty choking hazards during dry periods, and always served as homes for insects, snakes, and rodents. Families lived directly on these contaminated surfaces, eating meals and sleeping just inches away from accumulated waste and pest infestations.
The concept of sanitation, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist on the frontier. Human waste disposal was handled through outhouses, primitive structures built over holes in the ground with no consideration for groundwater contamination or disease prevention. These outhouses were typically located close to homes for convenience, meaning families lived just yards away from open sewage pits that attracted flies, rats, and other disease vectors. During winter, when temperatures made outdoor bathroom trips dangerous, many families used chamber pots inside their cabins. These containers of human waste were emptied infrequently, often stored under beds or in corners where they contributed to the overwhelming stench of frontier living. The contents were usually dumped directly onto the ground near the cabin, creating contaminated areas where children played and families worked.
Many frontier settlements had no organized waste disposal system at all. Garbage, human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial byproducts were simply thrown into streets, rivers, or vacant lots.
This created massive contamination of water sources and breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and rodents. The result was an environment so toxic that modern health officials would consider it uninhabitable. But the disgusting living conditions were just the setup for the real killer in the Wild West, disease. And we're not talking about dramatic shootouts or Indian raids like Hollywood would have you believe. Disease was the #1 cause of death on the frontier, claiming more lives than all other causes combined. These weren't just inconvenient illnesses like a cold or flu, but horrific, agonizing conditions that could transform healthy people into corpses in a matter of hours.
Cholera was absolutely the most terrifying threat you could face in the Wild West. This bacterial infection spread through contaminated water sources, and in the 1870s, virtually every water source on the frontier was contaminated. The disease could strike without warning, turning a perfectly healthy person into a dying victim in less than 24 hours. The symptoms were beyond horrific. Explosive diarrhea and projectile vomiting so severe that victims literally emptied their bodies of fluid faster than they could replace it.
Functions. Victims' eyes sank deep into their skulls. Their skin turned blue-gray from dehydration, and their voices became high-pitched whispers as their throats dried out. The cramping was so severe that people's muscles locked into permanent contractions. Death came through complete dehydration, but it took hours of conscious agony to get there.
Entire wagon trains were decimated by cholera outbreaks. Families would wake up to find half their traveling companions dead or dying with no way to help and no understanding of how to prevent the disease from spreading further. The Oregon Trail became known as the nation's longest graveyard, partly because of cholera epidemics that left thousands of bodies buried in shallow graves along the route. But cholera wasn't working alone in this frontier death lottery. Smallpox was equally terrifying and even more contagious. This viral infection was so communicable that a single infected person could spread it to dozens of others before showing any symptoms. The disease began with what seemed like a mild flu, then progressed to covering the victim's entire body with painful pustules filled with infectious pus.
These pustules weren't just on the skin, but inside the mouth, throat, and even the eyes, making eating, drinking, and breathing excruciating. About 30% of smallpox victims died, but those who survived were often left permanently disfigured with deep scars covering their faces and bodies. Many survivors were blinded by the pustules that formed in their eyes. Without any understanding of vaccination, frontier communities were completely defenseless against smallpox outbreaks. Typhoid fever was another merciless killer that spread through contaminated food and water. The disease caused high fevers that could reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit, severe headaches, weakness, and a distinctive rose-colored rash across the chest and abdomen. Victims often became delirious, speaking to people who weren't there, or becoming violent toward family members trying to care for them. The fever could last for weeks, slowly destroying the victim's intestinal system and causing internal bleeding. Many typhoid victims died not from the fever itself, but from complications like intestinal perforation, where holes literally formed in their digestive systems, causing massive internal infections. The mortality rate was around 20%, but those who survived often suffered permanent damage to their organs and nervous systems.
Diphtheria was particularly cruel because it targeted children more than adults. This bacterial infection created a thick, leathery membrane across the victim's throat, slowly suffocating them over several days. Children would literally strangle to death as their airways became completely blocked, while their terrified parents could do nothing but watch. The disease was highly contagious, often killing multiple children in single families within days of each other. Tuberculosis was perhaps the most insidious killer because it worked slowly, giving victims false hope while gradually destroying their lungs. Known as consumption because it seemed to consume people from the inside, tuberculosis caused victims to waste away over months or years. They would cough up blood, lose dramatic amounts of weight, and suffer from night sweats and fever.
The disease was incredibly contagious, spreading through coughing and close contact. Entire families would often contract tuberculosis from a single infected member, leading to slow, agonizing deaths that could stretch over years. The blood-stained handkerchiefs of tuberculosis victims became grim symbols of frontier mortality. Even minor injuries that we'd consider trivial today could turn into death sentences in the Wild West. A simple cut or scrape could become infected because nobody understood the importance of sterilization or wound care. Without antibiotics or proper antiseptics, infections spread rapidly through the body, causing blood poisoning, gangrene, and death. Gangrene was particularly horrifying because victims could watch parts of their bodies literally rot away while they were still alive. The affected tissue would turn black and emit a putrid smell as it decomposed. The only treatment was amputation, performed without anesthesia using unsterilized tools that often introduced even more infection. Many people chose to die rather than undergo these brutal surgical procedures.
The medical treatments available on the frontier were often worse than the diseases themselves. Doctors, when they existed at all, operated with medical knowledge that was centuries outdated and often completely wrong. Bloodletting was still considered a cure for many ailments, which involved opening veins to drain blood from already weakened patients. This practice killed more people than it saved, but was continued because doctors didn't understand how disease actually worked. Mercury compounds were prescribed for everything from syphilis to teething problems in children. These treatments caused mercury poisoning, leading to neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. Patients who survived their original illnesses often died from the toxic treatments their doctors administered. Opium-based medications were handed out freely for pain relief, creating widespread addiction problems. Many frontier women became addicted to laudanum, an opium tincture prescribed for menstrual cramps, headaches, and anxiety. These addictions often lasted for life and contributed to the high rates of mental health problems in frontier communities.
Now let's discuss what you'd be eating in this nightmare scenario, assuming you could find food at all. The frontier diet was brutally monotonous and so nutritionally deficient that it would be considered malnutrition by modern standards. Your typical meal consisted of the same 3 items day after day: beans, hardtack biscuits that were literally hard enough to break teeth, and salt pork that had been preserved with so much salt it barely resembled meat anymore. Hardtack was a particular form of culinary torture that frontier people endured out of necessity. These rock-hard biscuits were made from flour and water, baked until they achieved the consistency of concrete. They could last for months without spoiling, but eating them required soaking in water or coffee to soften them enough to chew. Even then, they often contained weevils, beetle larvae, and other insects that had infested the flour during storage.
The beans that formed another staple of the frontier diet were usually of poor quality and often contaminated with dirt, stones, and insect parts. They were typically cooked in large batches and eaten for days until they spoiled, at which point people often ate them anyway because throwing away food could mean starvation later. The constant diet of beans caused severe digestive problems and malnutrition because they lacked essential vitamins and minerals.
Salt pork was preserved using techniques that removed most of the nutritional value while adding dangerous levels of sodium. The preservation process involved packing meat in barrels with so much salt that it created a hostile environment for bacteria, but it also made the meat extremely difficult to digest and contributed to high blood pressure and kidney problems. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries that most settlers saw for only a few months per year, if at all. During the long winter months, families survived entirely on preserved foods and whatever they had managed to store from the previous growing season. This lack of fresh produce led to widespread vitamin deficiencies that caused serious health problems.
Scurvy was rampant among frontier populations, especially during winter and early spring when no fresh food was available. This vitamin C deficiency caused gums to bleed profusely, teeth to loosen and fall out, and wounds to refuse healing. Victims developed painful joints, extreme fatigue, and depression. In severe cases, old wounds would reopen and new injuries wouldn't heal at all. The psychological effects of scurvy were often overlooked, but they were devastating. Victims became severely depressed, anxious, and sometimes suicidal. Many frontier settlers who seemed to go crazy during winter months were actually suffering from advanced scurvy that affected their brain function. The disease was completely preventable with fresh fruits or vegetables, but these were unavailable for months at a time in most frontier locations. Even when food was available, it was often contaminated or spoiled. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly in summer heat. Stored grains were infested with insects, rodents, and their droppings. But people ate them anyway because throwing away food could mean starvation. Milk soured within hours of milking, and eggs often contained partially developed chicks.
Food poisoning was so common that constant stomach pain, diarrhea, and vomiting were considered normal parts of frontier life. People regularly ate food that would make modern health inspectors condemn entire restaurants simply because they had no alternatives. The combination of contaminated water and spoiled food created a perfect storm of digestive illnesses that weakened people's immune systems and made them vulnerable to more serious diseases. Water was another constant source of worry and illness. Clean drinking water was extremely scarce, and most people drank from sources that were also used for washing, watering livestock, and waste disposal. Wells were often contaminated with runoff from outhouses, animal waste, and decomposing organic matter. The water had a foul taste and smell, but people drank it because they had no choice. Rivers and streams that served as water sources for frontier communities were also used as transportation routes for waste disposal. Upstream communities dumped their garbage, human waste, and industrial byproducts directly into waterways, contaminating the supply for everyone downstream. This contaminated water spread dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that could kill entire families. The famous coffee that cowboys are known for drinking wasn't the romantic campfire brew depicted in movies. It was usually made from beans that had been stored for months in conditions that allowed them to become moldy and rancid. The coffee was boiled until it became bitter beyond belief, then mixed with eggshells, salt,
or even dirt to try to cut the harshness. The result tasted nothing like what modern people would recognize as coffee. Many settlers drank alcohol instead of water because it was often safer than contaminated water sources. But this led to widespread alcoholism that contributed to violence, accidents, and health problems. Children often drank diluted alcohol because their parents knew the water would make them sick. This created a population that was frequently intoxicated and unable to make good decisions about safety and health. The violence in the Wild West was nothing like the honorable gunfighter duels portrayed in Hollywood movies. Real frontier violence was sudden, brutal, and usually completely senseless. Forget those romantic images of skilled marksmen facing off at high noon in dusty streets. The reality was drunken bar fights that escalated into deadly encounters, domestic disputes that ended in murder, and random attacks by desperate criminals.
Most shootings involved alcohol-impaired men who got into arguments over trivial matters and pulled guns because they lacked the emotional control to resolve conflicts peacefully. These weren't skilled gunfighters with lightning-fast draws, but ordinary people who made terrible decisions while under the influence of alcohol. The results were messy, chaotic encounters that often killed or wounded innocent bystanders. Bar fights were incredibly common because saloons were often the only social gathering places in frontier communities. These establishments weren't the charming wooden buildings with swinging doors shown in movies, but crude structures with dirt floors, rough furniture, and terrible lighting. The alcohol served wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw spirits, often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra potency. Men would drink this toxic alcohol until they could barely stand, then get into arguments that quickly turned violent. Fights involved not just fists, but knives, broken bottles, chairs, and whatever weapons were available. Many of these brawls ended with serious injuries or deaths, but they were so common that they rarely made it into historical records unless someone particularly famous was involved.
Survival, and partly because of widespread alcoholism. Women and children had virtually no protection from violent men because law enforcement was minimal and social services didn't exist. Many women were trapped in abusive relationships because leaving meant facing the wilderness alone with children, which was usually a death sentence. The isolation of frontier life meant that domestic violence often went unreported and unpunished. A man could beat or even kill his wife and children with little risk of consequences because neighbors might be miles away and law enforcement might not exist at all. Many cases of domestic violence were never recorded in official documents because they were considered private family matters. Criminal violence was also completely different from movie portrayals. Bandits and outlaws weren't romantic figures robbing from the rich to give to the poor, but desperate criminals who preyed on anyone vulnerable enough to attack. Stagecoach robberies did occur, but they were brutal affairs where passengers were often beaten, sexually assaulted, or killed even when they cooperated with demands.
Highway robbery was common on isolated trails where travelers might go days without seeing other people. Criminals would ambush lone riders or small groups, taking everything of value and often killing witnesses to prevent identification. These robberies weren't quick, clean affairs, but extended ordeals where victims were tortured to reveal hidden valuables. Law enforcement was practically non-existent in most frontier areas. A single sheriff might be responsible for thousands of square miles of territory, making regular patrols impossible. These lawmen were often poorly trained, underpaid, and sometimes as corrupt as the criminals they were supposed to catch.
Many sheriffs supplemented their income through gambling, prostitution, or even banditry. In remote areas, justice was handled by vigilante groups who operated more like lynch mobs than legitimate authorities. These groups often acted on rumors or personal grudges rather than evidence. If you were accused of horse theft, cattle rustling, or any other serious crime, you might find yourself hanging from a tree within hours, regardless of whether you were actually guilty.
The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist in vigilante justice. Accused individuals were often tortured to extract confessions, then executed immediately without any form of trial. Many innocent people were killed by these mobs, but there was no legal recourse for families seeking justice for wrongful deaths. Even legitimate trials, when they occurred, were often corrupted by local politics, racism, or economic interests. Judges might be appointed based on political connections rather than legal knowledge. Juries were composed of whoever happened to be available, regardless of their ability to understand evidence or legal procedures. The natural environment itself was actively trying to kill you through weather conditions that could change from pleasant to deadly within minutes. Prairie fires were one of the most terrifying threats settlers faced. These fires could start from lightning strikes, careless campfires, or deliberate arson, then spread across thousands of acres faster than any horse could run.
The fires moved with terrifying speed, consuming everything in their path. Settlers caught in the path of prairie fires had virtually no chance of escape. The flames could travel faster than 20 miles per hour, creating walls of fire hundreds of feet high. The heat was so intense, it could kill people hundreds of yards away from the actual flames. Many settlers tried to create fire breaks by plowing strips of bare earth around their property, but these were often ineffective against large fires. Some families survived by jumping into wells or creeks, but others were overtaken before they could reach safety. The aftermath of prairie fires left landscapes completely barren, with nothing remaining but ash and the charred remains of anyone caught in the path. Blizzards were equally deadly and could strike with little warning. These weren't just heavy snowstorms, but life-threatening events with sub-zero temperatures, winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, and snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to zero. People could freeze to death just feet from their homes because they couldn't see where they were going in the whiteout conditions.
The cold during these blizzards was beyond what most modern people have ever experienced. Temperatures could drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The wind chill made conditions even more dangerous, creating effective temperatures cold enough to kill within an hour of exposure. Many settlers died during blizzards because they left their homes to tend livestock or gather firewood and became disoriented in the whiteout conditions. Search parties often found frozen bodies just yards from safety, victims who had lost their way in their own familiar surroundings. Entire families sometimes froze to death when their heating fuel ran out during extended storms. Drought was another environmental killer that could destroy entire communities over the course of months or years. When rains failed, crops withered and died, leaving families with no food and no income. Wells dried up, forcing people to travel increasingly long distances for water. Livestock died of thirst and starvation, eliminating another source of food and income.
The psychological effects of drought were devastating. Families watched their life's work literally blow away as topsoil turned to dust and was carried off by the wind. Many settlers abandoned their homesteads during severe droughts, but others stayed and slowly starved to death rather than admit defeat. Flash floods were the opposite extreme, but equally deadly. These floods could occur with little warning,
turning dry creek beds into raging torrents that swept away everything in their path. Entire wagon trains were washed away when travelers tried to cross flooded streams. Settlements built near water sources for convenience were regularly destroyed by sudden floods. Tornadoes were another weather-related killer that struck without warning. These massive storms could destroy years of hard work in seconds, killing anyone unlucky enough to be caught in their path. Without weather prediction systems, settlers had no warning when tornadoes were approaching. Many people were killed when their flimsy structures collapsed on top of them.
Even the wildlife was actively dangerous in ways that would terrify modern people. Venomous snakes were everywhere, including rattlesnakes, copperheads, and coral snakes that could deliver potentially fatal bites. These snakes often sought shelter in homes, barns, and other structures, creating constant danger for anyone moving around in dim light. Snake bites were essentially death sentences in many cases because effective antivenom didn't exist, and medical treatment was primitive. Victims often died slow, agonizing deaths as the venom destroyed their blood cells and nervous systems. Even non-fatal bites could cause permanent disability or disfigurement. Spiders presented another constant threat, particularly black widow spiders, whose venom could cause severe illness or death. These spiders were common in outhouses, wood piles, and storage areas where people regularly worked. Their bites caused excruciating pain, muscle cramping, and potentially fatal complications.
Large predators like bears, wolves, and mountain lions saw frontier settlements as sources of easy prey. Bears regularly raided food supplies, sometimes killing anyone who tried to protect their provisions. Mountain lions stalked children and small adults, occasionally dragging victims away to be eaten. Wolf packs would attack isolated travelers or settlers working alone in fields. These predator attacks weren't rare occurrences, but regular threats that shaped daily life. People couldn't work alone in fields or travel without weapons because animal attacks were common enough to be a constant concern. Children couldn't play safely outside unsupervised because predators might snatch them at any moment. Rabies was common among wild animals, and a bite from any infected creature meant certain death. Rabid animals would attack humans without provocation, and the disease they transmitted was always fatal. Victims of rabies bites faced weeks of knowing they would die horribly as the disease slowly destroyed their nervous systems.
Even domestic animals pose significant dangers. Horses and cattle could kill or seriously injure people through kicks, bites, or simply by their massive size. Many settlers were crushed by livestock or died from infections caused by animal injuries. Bulls were particularly dangerous and killed numerous farmers who underestimated their aggression. The psychological toll of frontier life was perhaps the most underestimated danger that modern people would find impossible to handle. The isolation was crushing for individuals accustomed to community connections and social support systems. Some settlers went months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family members. The silence and emptiness of the frontier drove many people to complete mental breakdown. Women were particularly vulnerable to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, a form of severe depression and anxiety triggered by endless isolation, hard work, and constant danger. The symptoms included hallucinations, violent outbursts, catatonia, and attempts at self-harm. Many women simply couldn't handle the psychological stress,
and either abandoned their families or harmed themselves. The condition was made worse by the complete lack of understanding about mental health. People experiencing psychological problems were often considered possessed by demons or simply weak-willed. There were no treatments available beyond restraint or confinement, which often made conditions worse. Men also suffered from psychological problems, though they were less likely to be documented. Many turned to alcohol as an escape from the stress, leading to widespread addiction that made dangerous situations even more deadly. Others became violent toward their families or neighbors as a way of coping with their psychological distress. Children grew up in this environment of constant stress and witnessed violence, death, and suffering as normal parts of daily existence. Many developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But at the time, their behavioral problems were attributed to moral failings or demonic possession.
The constant threat of death from disease, violence, weather, or accidents created a psychological state that modern people would find unbearable. Everyone lived with the knowledge that they or their loved ones could die at any moment from causes completely beyond their control. This uncertainty made long-term planning impossible and created chronic anxiety that affected entire populations. Self-harm and suicide rates were shockingly high among frontier populations, though these deaths were often not recorded accurately because of social stigma. Many people simply couldn't handle the combination of isolation, hardship, physical pain, and psychological stress. The act of ending one's own life was sometimes seen as a rational response to unbearable circumstances. Even survivors of frontier life often showed signs of severe psychological trauma. Many became extremely suspicious of strangers, hoarded supplies obsessively, or developed other behaviors that helped them survive but made normal social relationships difficult. The psychological scars of frontier life lasted for generations.
Let's talk about the work that was required to survive. Because frontier life meant back-breaking physical labor from before sunrise until well after sunset, 7 days a week, without any of the labor protections or safety measures we take for granted today. This wasn't a 40-hour work week with weekends off, but continuous, exhausting labor that permanently damaged people's bodies. Farming on the frontier meant breaking prairie sod that was so tough it could snap steel plows and permanently damage a person's spine. The prairie grass had roots that went down 6 feet or more, creating a mat so dense that breaking it required enormous physical effort. Men would spend entire days behind a plow, straining against sod that fought every step of the way. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Farmers developed permanent stoops from constantly leaning forward against resistant earth. Their hands became gnarled claws from gripping plow handles for hours at a time. Many suffered hernias, back injuries, and joint damage that left them in constant pain for the rest of their lives.
Even after the initial sod breaking was complete, farming remained brutally difficult. All work was done by hand or with simple tools that multiplied the physical effort required. Planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops involved bending, lifting, and carrying that would exhaust modern people within hours. Mining was arguably the deadliest profession on the frontier, with casualty rates that would be considered unacceptable in any modern industry. Underground mining involved descending into unstable tunnels that could collapse without warning, crushing miners where they stood. Cave-ins were so common that they were considered an ordinary hazard of the job.
The air quality in mines was toxic and potentially fatal. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with carbon monoxide, methane, and other poisonous gases that could suffocate miners instantly. Many workers died from gas exposure without any warning, simply collapsing and never waking up. Even miners who avoided immediate catastrophes faced long-term health consequences that were invariably fatal. They constantly inhaled fine rock dust that accumulated in their lungs, causing silicosis, a painful condition that slowly suffocated victims over months or years. The disease was irreversible and always fatal. Mercury used in gold and silver processing caused neurological damage that drove miners insane. Symptoms included tremors, memory loss, personality changes, and eventually complete mental breakdown. Many mining towns had significant populations of former miners who had been rendered mentally incompetent by mercury poisoning.
For all these risks and health consequences, miners earned barely enough to survive. Despite the mythology of striking it rich, the vast majority of miners lived in poverty, working for wages that barely covered basic necessities. The real profits went to mine owners and investors who never set foot underground. Ranch work was another deadly profession that bore no resemblance to the romantic cowboy image popularized in movies. Cowboys weren't heroic figures riding across beautiful landscapes, but poorly paid laborers who dealt with dangerous animals and harsh conditions for minimal compensation. Cattle were unpredictable animals weighing over 1,000 pounds that could crush, gore, or trample a person without warning. Bulls were particularly dangerous and killed numerous ranch workers who underestimated their aggression. Even seemingly docile cows could become violent when protecting calves or when startled by sudden movement.
Horses were equally dangerous, despite being essential for ranch work. These animals could kick with enough force to shatter bones or crush skulls. Many cowboys were killed or permanently disabled by horse-related injuries. Falling from a horse could result in being dragged if a foot became caught in a stirrup, often leading to fatal injuries. The famous cattle drives that moved herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points weren't romantic adventures, but grueling ordeals that pushed both animals and humans beyond their physical limits. Cowboys worked 20-hour days during these drives, catching brief moments of sleep in the saddle while keeping thousands of dangerous animals moving across hostile terrain. River crossings during cattle drives were particularly treacherous. Cattle could panic in water, creating deadly pileups that drowned both animals and cowboys. Strong currents could sweep away riders who tried to control panicking herds. Many cowboys drowned during these crossings, their bodies swept away and never recovered.
Stampedes were another constant threat that could turn thousands of animals into an unstoppable force of destruction. These could be triggered by lightning, unexpected sounds, or even the smell of predators. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death, their bodies crushed beyond recognition by thousands of hooves. The working conditions for cowboys were miserable by any standard. They slept on the ground in all weather conditions, often without adequate shelter. Their diet consisted mainly of beans, hardtack, and coffee, providing insufficient nutrition for the physical demands of their work. Many suffered from malnutrition, despite working around food sources. Most cowboys were very young men, often teenagers, who took these jobs because they had no other options.
Many were black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals who faced additional discrimination and violence. They earned about $30 per month for work that could easily kill them, and most didn't live long enough to find better employment.
Construction work in growing frontier towns was performed without any safety equipment or regulations that we would consider basic today. Workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses, safety lines, or protective equipment of any kind. Fatal falls were common and considered an acceptable cost of development. Railroad construction was particularly deadly, especially for Chinese immigrants, who were often assigned the most dangerous tasks. Building the Transcontinental Railroad required blasting through solid rock in mountain passes, work that involved handling unstable explosives under extremely hazardous conditions. Many Chinese workers were killed in explosions or buried in avalanches. The working conditions for railroad construction were beyond brutal. Workers labored in extreme weather conditions, from scorching desert heat to freezing mountain cold. They worked with hand tools and primitive machinery that offered no protection from injury. Accidents involving heavy equipment, falling rocks, and explosive materials killed workers regularly.
Medical care for injured workers was virtually non-existent. Railroad companies viewed workers as expendable and made no effort to provide safety equipment or medical treatment. Injured workers who couldn't continue working were simply abandoned wherever they happened to be, often dying from lack of medical attention. The next time you see a Western movie or read a frontier novel, remember the reality behind the myth. The real heroes of the American West weren't quick-draw artists or Indian fighters, but families who somehow managed to survive disease, starvation, violence, and isolation while building the foundation of communities that still exist today. Their legacy isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the quiet courage of people who refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. So, would you survive 24 hours in the real Wild West? After learning about the diseases, violence, environmental dangers, and psychological pressures that define frontier life, the honest answer is probably not. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. The fact that anyone managed to survive and thrive in those conditions is a testament to human resilience that deserves our respect and understanding, not romantic mythology that ignores their very real suffering and sacrifice.